Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad and honored to introduce this panel. I hope I won't disappoint, but I'll focus today on bank recovery and resolution. But I'm sure that the other discussants and panelists will discuss other issues of the banking regulatory framework. We're invited today by the organizers to reflect on the bigger picture. I think one way of doing this is to look at banks not in isolation from the rest of the economy, but as providers of services, jobs, and funding for growth, of course. And I want to say that's exactly the Commission's approach, to look at the broader objectives, keep them in mind when regulating. In particular, avoiding excessive risk-taking, of course, fighting threats to financial stability, restoring growth, fighting moral hazards, protecting taxpayers' money, and not the least, fostering consumer protection and satisfaction. And I'm sorry to hear in that regard that Mr. Klute is not here today because he dedicated much effort to promoting in the Parliament universal access to a basic bank account for those who are denied one because they can't afford or because they reside in another member state. And that brings me to the internal market. Preserving the internal market in banking is not only our mission at the Commission at DG Markt, it's also a source of growth and stability. Growth, because companies have access to wider funding opportunities to realize their project. But although it may sound counterintuitive, internal market in banking is also a factor of financial stability. Why? Because if the internal market is properly functioning, banks should be able to avoid putting all their eggs in the same basket, limit their exposure to a given sovereign or a given national economy, diversify their portfolio, and within a group, shift capital and liquidity where most needed to cushion shocks. So when these broader objectives are all met, banks can fail, or at least they should be able to fail. But of course, we're not yet there. I read recently an OECD paper that shows that still today, banks still benefit from a significant uplift in their credit rating due to the implicit guarantee that they enjoy, that they benefit from the state. So this is to address this situation that in last June, we made our directive proposal on bank recovery and resolution to make sure that there are rules and structures so that banks can fail without endangering the broader objectives, the broad system, with 5 main pillars. First, a planning process to define in good times the measures that can be available, that can be taken in bad times, to make banks subject to resolvability assessment by the authorities, with the possibility for authorities to impose structural change if there are impediments to the resolvability of the bank. Secondly, early intervention powers to react swiftly enough if the financial situation deteriorates. And thirdly, if the situation is irreversible, the possibility to apply resolution powers to preserve the systemic components of the bank, mainly deposit-taking activities and payment system, while closing down the rest, and most importantly, not putting the burden on the taxpayers, but putting a fair share of the burden on shareholders and creditors, as it should be in normal corporate governance. Fourthly, controversial issues perhaps we can discuss with the representative of the ABBL. Cross-border coordination mechanisms among national authorities with ultimately, possibly, binding mediation by the European Banking Authority. And fifthly, a financial chapter to ensure sufficient funding for restructuring and resolution with national funds, proper national funds, financed ex ante by the industry on the basis of risk-weight contribution. The negotiations on the directives are in progress, and we, of course, hope for a swift adoption in the coming months. But by then, already, new challenges have been arising, as you mentioned. I'll mention 2 work streams. First, the reflection on the structure of the banking sector. The Canonne high-level group released its report in October. Interestingly enough, especially for me who's working on resolution, the resolution framework features at a high level in this exercise. For example, the resolvability assessment exercise could be the basis for deciding on certain measures of additional structural separation. Following the release of the report, a consultation has been held in October and November. The Commission services are now reviewing the answers with a view to possible follow-up measures in the coming months, I suppose. Second workstream, the banking union, which I see as an initiative to rebalance the monetary union with the tools to prevent and resolve crises. The euro, the single currency, has been a great incentive for the development of the internal market in banking. But the response to crisis was still national and has proven clearly insufficient. Maybe we can quote Mervyn King that say that banks are European or international in life, but national in crisis. So clearly the firepower was insufficient. Member states played a role and they accepted to share the burden in an ad hoc and clearly to a certain extent. So the firepower must be increased, but there's no burden sharing without control sharing. And this is why I think the single supervisory mechanism has been called for by the European Council as the first step. Of course, we're not yet there either. About next steps, you probably saw that President Barroso had just released its blueprint communication, where he mentions a single resolution mechanism as a next step for the banking union. This will, of course, raise a number of important questions, difficult questions, so as who should assume the resolution, the authority, which handbook of rules it should apply, on which legal basis, etc. I think it's too early to answer these questions, but you'll be hearing from us. Thank you.